Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Westermann, Vice Chancellor of NYU Abu Dhabi, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 8th Vice Chancellor's Roundtable of this academic year. We will have one more to round out our 9 for this academic year, and that will be this coming Tuesday, April 11th at 11 a.m., 11 at 11, mark it down, with Peng Xiao, the CEO of G42, which is the organization that has been so crucial to bringing us the Sinopharm vaccines here in the UAE, among many other exciting enterprises at G42 that bring together science, data, and artificial intelligence to meet societal needs. But now first to our roundtable at hand. I'm very excited about it. In this series of conversations that we've been having, we meet leaders in the UAE and the world in many sectors of society and the economy, public and private, commercial and not-for-profit. We learn about the fundamentals of their different industries and civic endeavors. They often have many at once, as we've seen. And we learn about change and adaptation, success and sometimes failure, and what we can learn from it. We gain perspective in these conversations on different ways of being a leader. There's not one form of leadership. And on crafting lives of purpose and contribution. Leaders reflect with us on their own education and what it has meant to their trajectories. Thus far this year, we have spoken with leaders in real estate and urban development, banking and finance, diplomacy and international relations, strategic philanthropy and entrepreneurship, venture capital and minerals investment, and just last month, art collecting and wildlife conservation. And we spoke last fall with leadership at 2454 Image Nation about media, entertainment, and communications. And that connects to what we're doing today in a way, because today we will speak about media from a different perspective, that of journalism. It's a craft, a trade, a profession, a discipline, and an ethos very dear to my heart. I wanted to be a journalist back in the day. And it is very close to the mission of NYUAD as an institution that is dedicated to truth-seeking, to free academic inquiry, and to communicating public knowledge, much of which is also, of course, what a serious journalistic enterprise does. We have the perfect guest to help us think about journalism today. Mina Al-Oraibi, the editor-in-chief of The National, well known to most of you, I'm sure, a daily English language newspaper based in Abu Dhabi, but covering the broad MENASA region and global affairs well beyond it. The paper provides great coverage of education and culture as well, which I really appreciate. Not all newspapers do that. Prior to assuming her role at the National, Mina was a senior fellow at the Institute for State Effectiveness and a Yale World Fellow, among other accolades. Over her 18 years of experience as an Iraqi-British journalist, Mina has conducted very high-profile interviews you may have seen, including with Iraqi Prime Minister Mustafa AlKadhimi, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the former one, former President of the World Bank Yong Kim, and former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. She's an advisor to the Global Dignity Day movement and a member of the International Media Council, among other service positions that she holds. She completed her Bachelors of Arts and Masters of Arts in Modern History at University College London, and which is an institution very dear to my heart as well. And I always like to say, whenever we have someone from University College or with an association of it, I like to remind our community that New York University and University College London were created 5 years apart in the 1830s. And its initial leaders, Jeremy Bentham at University College and Gallatin at NYU, were in steady contact with each other to talk about that and to talk about what it meant to create a university that was not sectarian, not denominational, like every other university had been, but one dedicated to public service in the cities, in these burgeoning and growing cities of New York and London. So I always feel a deep connection with anybody who has anything to do with that great university, that is University College London, where Mina graduated from. So with that, Mina, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
Well, we're thrilled you're here with us. So let's jump right in. Let's talk about how you got to the place where you are. It is often really hard for us to imagine when we see someone so accomplished, how they got started. Could you tell us a little bit about how your career journey began and how you knew you wanted to be in this tough business of journalism?
Thanks, Mariette. It's a good question because I often wonder, how did I end up leading a newspaper? I knew I always wanted to be a journalist, and I feel really lucky that I'm at the National, I'm able to lead it. But you know, the three loves of my life are history, writing, and the Middle East. And combining the three together made me a journalist that focused primarily on the Middle East and what affects the Middle East. I always knew I wanted to be involved one or the other covering politics, and politics not only in terms of just the geopolitical developments, but the politics of life, the politics of society, culture, all of this. I studied history at UCL, as you mentioned, and I did both my BA and my master's. And really, what I love about history is that, you know, it tells people a story. There's a narrative, there's heroes, there's villains, all of this. But also journalism is the first rough draft of history. And so much of what we know, at least in the last 2 centuries, started being put together by journalists and so forth. So I knew with my love of history, my interest in politics in the region, that journalism was something I wanted to do. And I was lucky when I was in London, actually, NBC Middle East Broadcasting was based out of London then before they moved to Dubai. And so I got a little stint with them, and they were all lovely people, but it helped me decide after just a few weeks, I never wanted to go into television. So that also helped me nail it down to print. And so I did that as an internship. And then after I finished from university, graduated from university, I applied to Al newspaper, which was based in London. And I was keen to write in Arabic, even though all my education was in Arabic, but I was really keen to keep that connection with the Middle East and to write in Arabic. And I got my internship at Al-Hayat, and the rest is history.
Well, a few more things happened along the way. Tell us about deciding to take the position at the National. How did you get to the National?
It's a really fortunate coincidence, I think. The decision was made that the National would be relaunched in 2016. And it moved out of Abu Dhabi Media into IMI Holding, which is our parent company now. And when the decision was being made, they were looking around for journalists who had a track record in print journalism and international affairs, knew the region, etc. And my name somehow was mentioned. I'm still not really sure how that came about. And so somebody approached me in December 2016. And at the time I was at IST, I was at the Institute for State Effectiveness. I left a Sharq al-Awsat newspaper in 2015. And that was after 10 years running at the newspaper, day in, day out. You know, daily news is exhausting, but also when you're from the region, it's emotionally exhausting. And I basically left in 2015 because I felt I was depleted. I had been covering, you know, Iraq, Syria, the region, everything that had happened. And I first got into journalism in 2002 on the eve of the 2003 war in Iraq. And so there had been a real personal and emotional strain on me. And I think by 2015, I felt like I needed an out. So that's when I went to Yale, and I had taken a step back, and I went to ISE because I wanted to understand policy and everything, but I wanted to get out of the daily run, but I missed being in a newsroom. And so I had taken a year and a half or so, just about a year and a half away from the newsroom. So I felt like I was ready. I was ready to get back into the daily beast of daily headlines. And so when I was approached, and I heard it was the National, and I knew it was in Abu Dhabi, it was so appealing. So we had a quick conversation, a few conversations actually, and then I came out to take it on. And I think the biggest privilege I had was that it was a complete relaunch. And in this day and age, very few newspapers get that opportunity. So I think it's really foresight from IMI, from the UAE, to want to have a strong newspaper that, of course, is digitally focused, because that's the era we live in, while being rooted in serious journalism and rooted in newspaper tradition.
That's a great story. You said daily news is exhausting. I'm sure that editing the largest English newspaper in the UAE with more than 100 staff writers, as you are, is exhausting too, and challenging and interesting. Can you describe a typical day? I know there's no such thing as a typical day, but just describe a day, just to give students a sense. Journalism often sounds so glamorous, and tell us what it's like editing this.
Sure. You know, you're right. There is no such thing as a typical day, especially because so much of our day is dependent on what is actually happening that day from around the world. And the busy news days are actually not the problem. It's the problem is when very little is happening in the world, which sometimes does happen, and you have to think, okay, I still have to have a strong, front page. I still have to keep my readers engaged and so forth. So you'd be surprised that actually when it's a busy news day, it's actually quite fulfilling, and there's a lot to do, and you can assign people things. But sometimes you actually get slow news days, which are really challenging. But, of course, a typical day has changed dramatically because of COVID-19. So pre-COVID-19, a typical day would be everything from going to briefings, meeting sources, in addition to running the newsroom and having all the team around me. Now, so much as Zoom calls and Slack conversations and really being organized, it's very hard to maintain the same creativity. And so we now have 9 different touch points on Zoom calls. Even though before we only had 4 meetings in a day, we now have 9, because you want to make sure that it's still a robust day, news day, and that you've got everybody knowing what they're doing. So a typical day today starts with an early morning, as soon as I wake up, checking our handover notes, because our overnight team is based in the UK. And so they will send the homepage editor who's responsible will send a note and say, this is everything we've done overnight. These are the main things. So checking through that note and anything they flagged up, they send it to me and the senior editors and the homepage team. But then seeing what's happened in the world while we were sleeping. Checking, of course, the site. We have 6 different digital editions. So checking UAE, UK, US, international, MENA, and Gulf, and making sure they all make sense. Logging into Slack, saying good morning to the team via Slack. And then really figuring out what are our big stories this morning. What do we need to focus on? We have an 8 a.m. touch point just to check that everything's going well in terms of Zoom. And then there's the 9 a.m. This is the largest editorial meeting that we have with all the different sections, hearing from them, what's happening, and so forth. And then it's deciding whether our big stories, getting in touch with the bureaus, and depending on what's the big issue of the day or the 3-4 issues, I'm following them up. And then in between, there's all the things that include HR decisions, things like, what HR has to inform people, be it on COVID vaccines or be on Ramadan working hours. There's also the managing people side, as you said. I mean, the total team of the national in Abu Dhabi, London, Washington, Cairo, Amman, Baghdad, Beirut, all of that. In total, we're about 200 people now. So it's quite something. And so also making sure, touching base with our colleagues abroad. We often have late night meetings with the US team. So a typical day is a mix of following the news, coming up with story ideas, but importantly, engaging with my colleagues and seeing what their thoughts are. We have weekly meetings on everything from meeting digital targets to planning, to thinking about what are the big stories that are coming up this week in different countries. So a lot of it is planning. And then suddenly the news breaks and everything that you had planned goes out the window, and we're all rushing to make sure that we've got our breaking news on point, and getting that particular news story. So there's the events-driven news, and then there's the things that we've planned for long term. And then really the day doesn't end till about 11 p.m. for me, because that's when we send the newspaper to bed. So the front page gets sent to me before 11 p.m. should be around 10:30, quarter to 11. I proof everything. By then we would have decided everything. What is the main stories, the picture, everything is just the final proof. And once the paper goes to bed, usually by about 11 p.m. I start to kind of switch off. But I don't really switch off until I go to bed, which is terrible. I do not advise doing that.
I wanted our students to hear that, because I think I heard you say that you first sign into Slack to say hi at 5 a.m. Is that correct?
At 8 a.m. No, at 8 a.m.
Okay, good.
At 8 a.m.
Before then, you've had a little coffee, and you've already checked in what's coming in on your feeds and so forth. And what's the first feed you check into in the morning? Is it Twitter, or where do you start?
I start with my email because I'll have from, as I said, from our colleague, he or she would have sent us a note. And so I want to double check if there's anything from them. And then straight away, yes. In terms of news, Twitter, that would be my first, seeing what's come up on Twitter. And then I check, the news, everything from BBC to New York Times to Al-Arabiya and others. So I like to take a spin and see what are their news focus for the day. It's always good to compare, and then go back, of course, to the national and make sure that we've got everything in order.
We'll talk more about journalism. I want to stick with your personal journey for a little bit longer. Just to remind everyone who's here with us, if you have questions, you know what to do. Put them in the Q&A function. We'll look at them throughout. And Mina, I have lots to talk about, but we'll make sure that they get to your questions, of course, as well as we can. I just wanted to say to you, Mina, if you ever run out of stories, you know where to find the great faculty at NYU Abu Dhabi. We have a lot going on. You cover us. The paper is often interested in us, but just never forget us. We're here and we have lots of content. So any day.
And we're really grateful to you. I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but we really are grateful to your university, both for the research, the stories you provide us, speaking to your students across the board. So I genuinely mean it when I say I am grateful. I'm grateful for your presence, and I'm grateful for the cooperation and the trust you have in us in sharing a lot of these stories with us.
Our missions are, well, not the same. They are, as I tried to say in the introduction, they are rather cognate in so many ways. And we need a strong knowledge infrastructure and information infrastructure in the country. Let's talk a little bit about your educational journey. As you know, our students are from everywhere, and they often think of themselves as not just being of one culture or country, but because of the vagaries of life and the challenges of the contemporary world, they often belong in more than one country in some way. You yourself were born in Sweden, raised in Iraq, Australia, Saudi Arabia, and the UK, and now you are here. How do you reflect, when you have time to reflect, how do you reflect on this globally mobile upbringing and what it has done to you as a journalist, or how it has maybe been a resource for you?
I've been really lucky with the moves that we've made, but I have to say when I was younger, it was difficult. I'm originally from Iraq, and we were outside of Iraq during difficult times for Iraq, and for a period of time we were in exile. So from 1990 till 2003, my parents, my sister and I were in exile. And that was difficult, but it also made me also infatuated by, again, politics and how the politics of the decisions of a few, often of a few men, can determine the lives of millions of people. And that really was the case for Iraq with the terrible Kuwait invasion and everything that followed. And so part of the moves were politics and just the situation that my parents found themselves in. But part of the moves previous to that, my father was a diplomat, and we got to travel because he was representing Iraq. So two different, we had the diplomat's life and then we had the refugee life. So it was interesting because also the way that I think people treat you is very, very different. If you say I'm the daughter of a diplomat and you say I'm the daughter of a refugee, completely different scenarios there and how people treat you. Having said that, I think that living in different parts of the world, one, allowed me to be a better journalist because you had to fit in and you had to acclimatize, but also pick up on small details of how you can fit in. And I think those things actually allowed me as a journalist to build rapport with people much quicker because I had to learn on my feet very quickly to fit in and make rapport with people. I'm also very lucky that my parents always insisted on us, my sister and I, having very strong foundational Arabic and learning Arabic at home. We always went to English language schooling. Arabic was very important to both my parents, both not only just reading and writing, but the music, the culture, and so forth. So they immersed us in it, even though I left Iraq when I was 6, my sister was 8. But the language, the culture, all of that was really important. I think that's helped me greatly in my career, having strong Arabic, but also understanding culture and having, my feet firmly in both the East and West at different times. So that was really helpful. And I think I was really lucky that my parents, in the end, chose for us to seek refuge in the UK because the United Kingdom gave me a lot, importantly, my education, of course. And I think that has molded much of my professional approach to life, especially going to UCL.
You already spoke a little bit about UCL and journalism being the first draft of history, and yet journalism also it has to do other things besides thinking of itself as the first draft of history. What did you learn as a history student that you think has affected your career? Can you talk a little bit about that relationship between what you did in university and what you did on the outside?
Sure. I mean, first I'd say just about UCL and, as you said, close to NYU. One of the things I'm really proud of at UCL is that it was the first university in England to be established, 1826, that's admitted men and women on equal footing and was, as you said, non-sectarian. It didn't matter what your religion was. And so when I went and I started my studies there in 1999, which is ancient history for your students listening to us now, but at the time, felt really excited to be going to university at a place where equality and open-mindedness and the acceptance of all, depending on merit, was so important. And so I think actually going to university, that institution and the principles it was founded on really impacted who I am today. And I feel that, and I think it was really drilled in with us, especially for those of us who studied humanities. You really heard about it and felt it at UCL. I think studying history for a journalist is so important. One is about sourcing, and especially in today's world where there is such confusion about sourcing, that everything that's published could have so many different original sources, and how careful we have to be and meticulous we have to be about understanding sourcing. I think when you have a good foundational grounding as a historian, that really helps you. So that's one thing that definitely I can see as a transferable skill straight from my history days, and how much my professors would question, especially if you're dealing with primary sources, original documents, and so forth, and how you make sure you've asked all the questions and make sure you have double sourcing and so forth. So that's one. The second is this idea of narrative, understanding that any history book you read, let alone 600-word article, is already limited, that we are subjective, that historians that write the history books often are subjective. And the question is, are they conscious of their bias, or is it an unconscious bias? Is it being paid for to be in a certain way or not? And so I think having that understanding and knowing that narratives are usually put together for a reason also makes you understand as a journalist. I think sometimes you have certain journalists who are like, we are 100% objective, 100% independent. I don't think that's true. Unfortunately, I think the reality is when you only have 600 words, what you choose to write, or when you only can choose one picture for the front page, the message you want to give with that picture in the front page, all of that is chosen for a reason. And the question is, are you fair? Do you declare your bias in advance or not? Are you aware of that? And that's something that I really learned through learning history and from my professors, learning from them about this idea of, is history being written by the victors, or what is the bias that could have gone into this particular framing of a historical narrative, and how that impacts our day-to-day journalism today. So there's lots. I think I was really lucky that I did study history and at UCL in order to follow a career in journalism.
That's a great plea for history and the humanities. And of course, history will make you write, and you learn to write. So this is, and craft a narrative, as you say, beautiful. So you mentioned your professor at NYU, professors rather. Now, it may not be your professors who were most important to you, but we really look a lot at NYU Abu Dhabi at mentorship, academic and professional, and the in between. Are there particular mentors who stand out to you as you think back on your path?
There are so many mentors, so it's really hard when somebody asks about mentors, because you're right, at university, I had one of my professors, Rebecca Spang, who taught me a class that was entitled Rousseau, Marx, and Freud, and how they impacted our modern societies and their historical significance and linkages. And Professor Spang was amazing. And she was both my professor when I did my undergraduate, and part of the reason I decided to do my master's at UCL was just to have the chance to be taught by her again. And she is an incredible historian of the French Revolution, understands revolution and changes in society, but also had a fixation with food, and actually wrote a book about the history of restaurants in France. And so one of the great things about her was she explained that, you could take a snapshot like restaurants and tell such a story through that it doesn't always have to be just the political history or something, or it has to be, she didn't believe in this thing of light and heavy kind of stories or history of societies, that it's all interlinked. So she was definitely one. But I'd say as a journalist, again, I've been really lucky with some great mentors in journalism. But one of them who sadly is no longer with us, and I always remember, is Richard Beeston, and he was the foreign editor of the Times of London. And Richard was incredible, and he was kind, and he taught me the importance of kindness. And in journalism, there's a real competition. There's competition for scoops. There's competition for who gets an interview. There's competition on everything. But the nice thing about him was that you could be competitive and also be kind and also be fair. And the first time I went to Downing Street to cover Downing Street, I went in. I was by far the youngest one. I was one of the very few women there in the Downing Street press office, and I was working for Ashaq al-Awsat at the time, which hardly anybody knew. I was working for Al-Hayat, hardly anybody knew in English, and after that, when I worked for Ashaq al-Awsat, it was such a mouthful, most people didn't know where I worked for. And so it doesn't make you as confident. And so I went into Downing Street press briefing first time, and I didn't even know where to sit. I didn't know if it was assigned seating. I was totally overwhelmed, totally overwhelmed. And I was 23 at the time, totally overwhelmed, not knowing where to sit. And this lovely gentleman in a suit got up and said, "You're new here. We haven't seen you here before." And I said, "Yes, I'm a new journalist." And he said, come here, you can sit here." And he talked me through everything, the process, what it would be like, when I could raise my hand, not to feel intimidated and everything. And then we became friends and remained friends until he sadly passed away from an illness several years later. But the great thing, like I said, about Richard is he taught me how important it is that and he was a big shot, he was the foreign editor of the Times of London, and yet always looked out for somebody who might be new to the game, who might not know enough people, always open doors. And just taught me how important that is, even in something as competitive as journalism, that you must be kind first, and always help somebody who's coming up the ladder, when you're and he really was at the top of the ladder in his career. It always made, not just for me, everybody who knows him remembers him that way, because he always lent a helping hand.
This is a beautiful story and point about mentoring and professional collegiality. That this big deal editor worry, to do that. I think it's a very good point, because in the end, of course, you may have competition, but still, you want your whole field to be lifted, and kindness in general as a human quality goes a very long way. Thank you for reminding us of that. Before we go on to the field of journalism more broadly, which we'll do next, here's a question from one attendee who asks you, what is the most irritating part of your job, Mina? Nobody ever asks me that.
Oh my God, where do I begin? I think can I say two?
Yes, please.
One is that, you really can't switch off. I mean, even if you go on holiday, because you're in the news business, you can't come back and try to catch up on a week's worth of news. You just can't. And if you've missed something, you suddenly can't put the pieces of the puzzle together. And now with 24-hour news cycles and everything else, it is, to do the job well, I think you need to be connected much more than 10, 15 years ago, frankly. And so in a way, that makes it really exciting and so forth, but it is irritating. Sometimes you just want to say, actually, I don't want to know what's going on for about a week, and then I'll come and catch up, and it's really hard to catch up. So everyone. The second, I think, one of the most irritating parts of a really brilliant job is that, people take offense sometimes, or assume ill intent when a headline is written a certain way or something is written in a certain way. And some people are great, and they approach you and they'll write a letter to the editor, or they'll call whatever, and they'll inquire first, or they'll try to get a correction or whatever it is. But others are actually not like that, and quite vindictive. And I think that hurts, because we work so hard day in, day out. We publish on average per day about 180 pieces between articles and independent videos and newsletters and so forth. So every now and then the framing might not have been the best, or anything can happen. And it really is irritating when people come to you with this kind of like, you guys are trying to be nefarious, or you're trying to poke at something, or it's like, no, actually this is the framing we're trying. So that would be probably the most irritating part of an otherwise wonderful job.
Those are two very good overarching points, I think. And I hadn't thought about so much your second point, that with 180 or so stories and 100 writers or more coming in, plus the syndicated stuff that comes in, plus, you know, stuff that comes in over the wire that you also have to run in some way. You know, how do you run your fact-checking operation? How do you verify on these extremely short and tight timelines? What is that like at the national? How do you do
So
that?
we have several layers for different elements. So you know, everything, we have this thing about two pairs of eyes if it's breaking news, for example. And so you know, we will only use, I'll give you an example, US elections. So you know, you're not sure when someone is going to declare a state has gone to this candidate or that candidate. So we had in advance agreed that it's either AP or two major networks. We wouldn't go just with one major network. So we put the boundaries of what we will take as accepted. And then even that, if it's AP and it's come and somebody's typed it, there always has to be a second pair of eyes that sees it to make sure there's no typo, there's nothing wrong, and so forth. So that's at the very basic. But when it comes to articles and fact checking, things like that, at least three people read any particular thing that goes out, be it an actual article or a video or even our social media. All of our social media posts get, you know, somebody writes it, somebody checks it, and then a final senior editor approves it. Just to make sure that everything is in order. But even having said that, sometimes, you know, something will slip, and it's the most frustrating thing in the world when a mistake happens, because of course that's what everybody remembers. But we have three layers at any given point. Our sub editors are so important because they are really our last line of defense. Everything from punctuation and accurate writing to also fact checking. If something, you know, doesn't add up, they'll always go back to it. And we put in a lot of emphasis on that to the journalists, double sourcing everything, making sure that they will tell us about their sources. Sometimes there's anonymous sources. We have very strict guidelines of when and how we use anonymous sources and who actually knows the identity, etc. So it's really different levels or different processes, but there's always three levels of checks on anything that goes out.
It also sounds, therefore, that there are other opportunities for being part in a journalistic enterprise if you're looking for a job. You don't always, not everyone has to be a frontline editor or writer. Is that so?
Absolutely, absolutely. Our picture editors, for example, you'll never know their name, but they are so crucial to us finding the right photo, making sure that it's accurate, where it's sourced and everything. Likewise with sub editors, likewise with video journalists. Some of our video journalists are actually in front of the camera or doing their own production, and others, they're just editing and cutting and posting. Likewise with our podcast producers. So, you know, there are people who want to be front and center, want to see their byline and want to be out there covering, but there are others who are equally as important, who are behind the scenes and putting it all together and making sure that it all comes together and it's accurate, or certain elements. We have our graphics team. I mean, so many people that you'll never know who they are, but our graphics and our maps and so forth are things to them.
Mm-hmm. That's I think very encouraging to people who want to know how to enter and where you might end up. So following up on the first of your most irritating things, I love the question. That was, it didn't come from us, it's an attendee, but this is, you know, this person is very sympathetic and says, Mina, could you please tell what helps you to get the job done, given that you can, I think, meaning given that you never can switch off as the main editor? Is it coffee, daily rituals, exercise? What is it in you that makes it possible for you to keep doing this work and take on that position?
Well, I mean, I feel really lucky that I get to do it, and especially when I wake up in the morning and go through the physical paper. I'm very old-fashioned like that. I love going through the physical paper and feeling real sense of pride. You know, you were asking about syndicated work. We actually, all our coverage is either original stories or news gathering, or we use the wires, so Reuters, APFP, and Bloomberg. But everything else, you know, over 70% of the content in the national is original. So I feel really proud seeing our team and what they've done. So really and genuinely, that gives me such pride. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, of course, there are things like eating healthy, making sure I spend time with my parents and my sister and good friends, and exercising, absolutely. That's one of them. But also, you know, it genuinely is a privilege, and the fact that I get to run one of the most established outlets in the region in the English language, and getting those voices out there is the thing that keeps me going. But I'd say also making sure, again, taking breaks throughout the day, spending time with my colleagues, chatting. This is why it was really difficult when we weren't in the newsroom. We're at 30% capacity in the newsroom at the moment. Working from home was a drain because I'm one of those people that actually gets excited and gets energy from my colleagues and planning things together and so forth. So that's something else that really does keep me going, is that I have a really nice team. And one of the things about the National, it's not an angry newsroom. It's a serious newsroom. We get things done, but nobody's ever angry. And so that for me is really important, having a nice newsroom to go into.
The culture of the newsroom, I'm sure there's plenty of opportunity for tension and stress, and it sounds like you've created a very collegial environment. Maybe your mentor had something to do with that. So let's talk about journalism as a field of practice and a profession. It obviously has undergone a massive digital transformation in the last few decades. What would you say are the major challenges for digital journalism right now and in the Middle East looking ahead? Reflect with us. You've been part of the change, and you still love the physical newspaper, which I do too, but of course the news never stops rolling out on your app and so forth. Tell us a little bit about this transformation and what more we can expect.
I do love the physical newspaper, but I also love the fact that we can have 6 different digital editions on the website. When you go in, you can choose what edition you want, and the fact that we have millions of readers that will never see the newspaper because we only print and distribute in the UAE. And so it kind of is incredible. Digital journalism has opened doors that would have been impossible previously. But at the same time, the actual definition of journalism has become much more difficult. I say that today, all of us can be publishers. You open up a LinkedIn account or a Medium account or a Twitter account, and you can publish, you can write and publish. It doesn't make you a journalist. So while all of us can be publishers, we can't all be journalists. And so the principles and the standards of journalism are really important, and we have to protect them. And I think one of the real challenges for digital journalism everywhere in the world, but particularly in the Middle East, because we're going through a transformation now when it comes to the commercial aspect of journalism, that perhaps we're behind the US and Europe and otherwise, where advertisers now are jumping in on things like, they call it native advertising. So they're actually advertising you, but it doesn't come across as an advert, which I'm very much against. We're very clear when we have paid content or sponsored content, we call it as such, because it's very important. So the blurring of lines between what's an ad and what's an actual journalistic piece of content is very concerning. And I think that media agencies in the region are trying to push forward a narrative that this is what everybody does, this is what the rest of the world does, and it's not. It's very different. And I think while you have to be nuanced in how you push out a certain piece of content as paid content or sponsored, you have to be very clear about it. And I think that is a real threat for journalism. And it's not just here, it's everywhere in the world. But when we're looking at the Middle East, I think now we have certain media advertising agencies that are really squeezing media outlets. And it is of huge concern for me, frankly. Another real challenge is that quite often the technology we're using isn't indigenous technology. And in some ways that's great because we're taking the best of what was developed by Twitter and Google and others. But quite often it's imported and we're using it, and it's not often being adapted to best suit our readers or our way of reading and so forth, or consuming media and so forth. So I wish that we could have more, and I think the UAE is being great at that now, investing in R&D and tech and the creative industries, so we can have more and more that's actually more indigenous, and we could be leaders rather than always just adopting what others are doing. So I think that's a challenge, but it's also a real opportunity, and I'm excited about that. And I think we at the National, for example, were among the first to get a Google News Initiative grant for something that we're developing, and our developers are working on it. We're working with Google on it, and we're hoping to launch it in a few months' time, and you'll see it. So that's something I'm really proud of, but I think we have to do more of that, and we have to push ourselves to say that we can't just be adopters of certain advancements. We also have to make those advancements ourselves, and I think there has to be more investment in that. And the final point I'd say, sorry, you're going to say something.
Go ahead, please. No, that's very interesting. Please go.
Yeah, and the final thing I'd say is also in terms of where I see media going. I think more and more will be connected to audio, and that's quite exciting. Be it podcasting, which is really coming up in the region, to everything to actually audio-enabled websites, so you can hear the news rather than just read or watch videos. So I think audio is a really exciting medium, but at the same time, we're seeing that it will face its challenges, as certain people might want to block certain applications and others. So how audio will actually be dealt with in the region will be important, and I hope it will be given more time, because I personally think that audio is a great medium rather than just video, because video content at the moment, most people consume video content, which is great, but it takes up all your senses, whereas with audio you can actually do other things while listening to news report or podcast, so forth. So I think that's one of also the opportunities, but here it's still nascent.
I'm really happy to hear you say that about audio, although I must say I really enjoy the short video content. That's lovely narratives during the pandemic, especially on the national. I've tuned into it a lot. But you're right about audio. I feel about audio the way I do sometimes about reading a novel, which is that the picture isn't already filled in for you. There's still, you can imagine the visual, even as you can also do other things. You can say, I've been my walking, I listen a lot these days. But that idea that there's a certain space for the consumer, the listener, the reader to interact where it isn't already determined what you're going to think of it. I think that's I'm happy to hear you being enthusiastic about podcasts. It's also to me a little bit the closest thing to old-fashioned radio that we now have.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite interesting. We brought somebody to the National to train our team who's a great podcaster, but previously had been in radio for years. And he said it's radio in a new form. It's just new technology, but at its essence, it's what radio programming used to provide.
It's radio on demand, basically. But so that's wonderful. Do you think you talked a little bit about these challenges with advertising companies, what media really is? I think for our students, it would really be helpful to hear you on this. Sometimes people lump everything together as if journalism, media, Facebook are all sort of the same thing. And I think I'm hearing you say that. How do we, what is the place of journalism in this kind of landscape and in a society like the UAE?
The amount of times when people say it's the media's fault, I'm like, what do you mean by that? Who's the media, And it's really funny because in the US, if they're trying to be nuanced, they'll say mainstream media. And I'm like, what does that even mean, So no, media is not all the same. And again, media, what does it actually mean? The different mediums through which you're getting your news or getting information. And there is a confusion about that. I mean, first, I think media literacy really should become part of school curricula. That's something that I've spoken quite a bit about to different entities. And I believe that we have to have media literacy because today, most of the information you're getting is not through your school or your university or very well-known outlets. Rather, it's through WhatsApp, or it's through social media. And many studies have been done, including by Edelman, that you trust primarily what is sent to you from somebody you know personally. And quite often people will say, well, I just received this. And they will say, it's not my job to make sure it's verified, which is fair enough, but you have a responsibility if you're sharing something. So media literacy and understanding of sources is hugely important. Second, journalism, as I was saying earlier, is you can publish something, doesn't make you a journalist. So having those principles of journalism, and journalism is about fact checking, it's about responsibility of where your sourcing it has come from. It's about being a known source, not an anonymous source. Sometimes you were saying about the videos, our small videos have our watermarked end, so this is the national. There are other people who are producing videos that don't watermark it, and once it's shared enough times on WhatsApp or other medium, then you don't actually know who's behind it or what is the point. So, for example, you have a huge problem with vaccines and people spreading misinformation about vaccines, and you actually can't source where it's from unless you're doing forensic work for a government. But for ordinary users, it can be really difficult, and even for governments doing forensic work, it's quite difficult. So I think understanding all these complexities is really important, especially for digital natives who are growing up where that's the norm. I think for some of us who are digital immigrants who have seen what it was like to have very specific known sources, even if they have their own biases, but you could know who was behind them, as opposed to now where there's this avalanche of information, and that's not the same as journalism. And I think using that catch-all term media actually confuses things rather than clarifies them.
Yeah, well, I would agree. Media is just a medium, can be almost anything. Certainly in art history, we have a whole different way of thinking about something through which communication is conveyed, basically. But communication is not necessarily journalism. In 2015, you wrote an article for the World Economic Forum on why credibility is the future of journalism. And that was at a time that the digital had definitely arrived and social media were becoming very prominent. How do journalists and media outlets maintain credibility in the age of social media and the information revolution, including the disinformation revolution?
So, I think credibility is built based on a relationship. So it's when you've seen enough of the national or another media outlet that you know that they have a track record for delivering accurate, truthful news or reporting and so forth. Because long term, that's what people will look for. And so while we say there is this avalanche of information and so forth, I think with time, people are beginning to look for those credible sources who can they trust. And we saw that particularly with COVID-19, where people always wanted to go, okay, what is the verified source of this news? And I think that's actually been quite a turning point. I think you maintain credibility by accuracy, by a track record, and when you make a mistake, to issue a correction, because I think that's equally important. The problem today with digital publishing is that people can go back and change something or just delete something without explaining why they've done that. And I think it's really important to maintain credibility of why these changes, an editor's note at the bottom or a correction printed in the paper and so forth. It's usually important. And I think you also maintain credibility by explaining where you're coming from. I think quite often people ask me and they say, the National is based out of Abu Dhabi. Do you not have any editorial guidelines? And I said, there's not a single outlet in the world that doesn't have editorial guidelines. There's not a single outlet in the world that doesn't have to deliver for its publisher. Publishers, there is that relationship between the editorial side and the publishing side and the publisher's side. And I think quite often, unfortunately, especially in this part of the world, people almost want to hide that away or pretend to be something they're not. And I think that's also when you lose your credibility. So I always tell people about the National, we're based here, we reflect the viewpoint that we see sitting from Abu Dhabi. I'm not going to give you what a journalist who was sitting in Stockholm would tell you, because their vantage point from Stockholm is completely different. So we are the National coming from here, and that's where our viewpoint comes from. So I think things like that are also important for building your credibility, where you're coming from, what that vantage point is.
That's a very helpful way to think about it, that sort of discernment that you speak about, and how we ourselves as readers can be alert to it, and listeners. You're also a very experienced interviewer, and you've kept doing that even while editing the paper. And want to ask you a little bit about that practice. So the people you interview are never, of course, the interviewer, as an interviewer yourself, or rather, I want to put it the other way around. You've already said journalists are not necessarily objective. They try to be as fair as possible, but they come with a body and a perspective and so forth. Now, the same can be said for interviewees. They are hardly innocent witnesses. They, of course, are not disinterested observers or journalists themselves. They have things to say that maybe are not the ones you're interested in. How do you, as an interviewer, elicit the information that you really want to get at because you think it's the most relevant for your readers and your narrative, even if it's not what the person wants to tell you? Can you give us a few tricks of the trade?
Yeah, this is interesting because it really is dependent on the person you're interviewing. And unfortunately, I think in the modern era, a lot of officials particularly are trained to speak without saying anything.
Right.
And that is really frustrating because it's like, Why are you then giving me this interview? If all you want to give me are your talking points or your policy notes, we have that. We can get that in an email. Don't waste my time. So I think they do themselves a disservice, and they do their entities or their ministries or their countries a disservice by just repeating old tired lines, because frankly, people won't pay attention to it. So I think one is to see who you're going to interview. And for me, anyone I interview, and thank God for the internet now, I will always go and see previous, if I've never met them before, watch previous interviews of them, see if they're the sort of people. Some people will give you one-word answers. And so you have to think, how do I follow up? How do I follow up? And others will speak for 3 minutes. If they've only assigned you 20 minutes for the interview, and if every question you ask, they speak for 4 rambling minutes, how do you interject without cutting them off too much? Because they might at minute 3.45 say something that is actually useful, right? So you don't want to interject too much, but you want them to get to the point, because they could be just wasting time. So there are all these tricks that you have to try to navigate. But you also want to be fair. And, for me, I'll give you an example. Just last week, 10 days ago, John Kerry was here, and he is now the US climate envoy, and he's here with a very clear mandate to talk about climate. And so, of course, John Kerry knows everything about the region. He was the Secretary of State, and you'd love to ask him what he thinks about the Iran deal and all this stuff. There's no point. He's here as the climate envoy. So you can have the choice of trying to spend, I had 15 minutes or so with him. I could have wasted the 15 minutes saying, but you were there for the Iran thing. Do you think anything will happen? Is the US going to pull out troops? Blah, blah, blah. And he's going to come back and say, I can't really answer that. I'm here for this, that. Or I can say, this is actually his portfolio. And while I'd love to get the juicy political stuff, I know he's not going to touch that because that's not in his remit. Let me get the best out of this really important portfolio, which is the climate portfolio, which is crucial, important, da, da, da. And so ask them questions that they're actually able to talk about, because one of those things that you have to appreciate when it's an on-the-record interview. Of course, they have their considerations. Of course, they're not innocent bystanders, but you try to coax them to come out with something that is relevant, that is real. But you never want to trip them up. I'm not that sort of journalist. Some journalists are great at tripping you up and making you say something in passing that you didn't actually mean, and that becomes the headline. And I'm really against that sort of journalism, because I think it's not my job to trip you up if you give me an interview. That's different from if I know that you're trying to mislead, then that's different. Then you have to go back and push. And I've had those sorts of interviews where the answer is clearly not accurate or not true, and really push them. And I once had that with a certain Arab official who wanted to claim that the Syrians in Lebanon are not refugees, and so they don't have the rights of refugees. And it was that sort of interview where we had 20 minutes, and I spent the entire 20 minutes saying, no, how can you say they're not refugees? Because frankly, I mean, if this the so-called official is going to start from that assumption, then the rest of the conversation is built on a false premise. So then you have to, that's different, right? But I think, again, when you're interviewing somebody, you have to ask them what they're within the parameters of their particular job and so forth. So it is a skill. And I'd say so always look them up and see how they talk, so you can figure out your questions according to that. So do your homework really in how they speak. The second is make sure that it's within the confines of what their job actually is, their remit. Try to build a rapport where possible before the dictaphone or whatever has started rolling. So you can build a rapport and say, listen, I'm thinking of asking about this, and win them over and have them feel comfortable in the conversation, because I don't believe in gotcha journalism. I think that's, for some people it works. For me, it's not really what I went into journalism for.
It seems very good advice given your geopolitical mandate, or that's an area of specialty for you. And I mentioned all those people you've interviewed. And of course, there are going to be limitations to what a Secretary of State's going to tell you. And they're very well trained not to tell you certain things, although it must also be delicious sometimes to get a little sip. But I think you drew a very nice distinction for all of us between when you really have to stand your ground because a piece of utter untruth is about to be the premise of an interview, then you lose credibility. It connects to that credibility question, I would say. Here's a question I want to, in this context, put to you. This is Charlie Fong, who is a news editor at the Gazelle, our beloved Abu Dhabi student-led paper. And he's interested in becoming a war correspondent in the Middle East. What tips do you have for Charlie as a non-Arab person trying to break into the journalism world here?
So, so many tips. Okay, so the first is from This is from a great mentor that I continue to have. But it's funny because now he writes a column for the Nationals. He says, now you're my editor. I can't really be your mentor, which is not true. Gavin Esler, who's a brilliant journalist. And, you know, Gavin said something to me many years ago, and he said, not every correspondent has to be a war correspondent. And you can go and cover a place that has conflict or is recovering from conflict without thinking of yourself as just a war correspondent, in the sense of take in all the wider dynamics that are happening. That these are societies, these are stories. It could be the snapshot of the baker and how the baker is trying to get bread to these areas. It could be the snapshot of the fighter, where yes, they are a fighter, but how did they get into it? But he said, you know, don't this, I think, traditional view of the war correspondent, especially since so many, unfortunately, of the conflicts and the wars we have in this region are either civilian, civil war, sorry, or they're civilian-led, and then militias come in and so forth. They're irregular warfare. So I would say always think about that. That framing of war correspondent can be sometimes tenuous. Second thing I'd say is if you're working in the region, languages are really important, and you may not necessarily learn Arabic entirely or Kurdish entirely or Persian, but have a few words. And I think it's really important to at least have a few words. Again, the breaking of the ice, the winning of trust, making sure that you have language, because while everybody kind of speaks English and you can get through the region without really ever learning words of Arabic, really makes a difference. Arabic or Kurdish or Persian or Turkish, whatever it is that you might pick up. That really helps before you're going somewhere. The other advice I'd say is it is great to freelance, but it's also really important, if possible, to get a staff position somewhere, because I think, again, in the modern era, there are so many freelancers around that you can end up trying to compete for the same story with 20 other people going to only certain outlets. So where possible, get a staff position. You can learn a lot from other editors. You get much more mentorship where possible. And if not possible to get that staff position, then really important to build those relationships with particular editors that you can pitch to and so forth. And finally, but most importantly, be safe. Unfortunately, I think journalists are increasingly targeted. And so making sure that you've got your security always in order, that should always be priority number one.
Thank you for giving such excellent suggestions and advice. And your point about a staff position goes in almost any profession, I would say. We all have to start somewhere. And what looks from the outside of the ultimate goal, something may happen along the way that will also change your view of that. But these are very good bits of advice. I wanted to ask you about language, actually, given that you have both worked for an Arabic language paper and the Ashraq al-Awsat, which was a long one to pronounce, as you say.
You did it beautifully.
And I've learned my few words. And for the national, how is running a full English language newspaper here different from running one in Arabic or writing for one in Arabic? And do you worry about the segmentation of audiences? Can you talk a little bit about overlap there with the Arabic language newspapers here, and also how you see yourself as different? Just talk a little bit about that language.
Sure. You know, it's quite funny because, of course, I worked at Sharq al-Awsat and I was the assistant editor-in-chief. So I was doing the day-to-day running of the paper, Sharq al-Awsat in London, looking towards an Arabic language audience.
That's interesting.
In Arabic. And then I came to Abu Dhabi working in English, targeting mainly an English language speaking audience. So the complete opposite, you know, it would have been easy to go for an Arabic paper in an Arabic society and keep it quite limited in terms of readership, or vice versa in London and keep sticking to a UK audience. But the point for both of them is it was an international audience. And I think sometimes what happens is people like to segment readership or audience into geographic locales. And I actually don't think where we are can be the number one defining aspect of our persona, so to speak. Because I think it is your interests, your either professional background or personal background that will pull you towards a particular news outlet, be it progressive, conservative, interested in these topics. And you said we put a real focus on education, on culture, on environmental stories that others wouldn't. But at the same time, we are also very interested in heritage and conservation and so forth that others may not be. So I think the persona of who you're appealing to, rather than just a particular geography. And so I think I've been lucky because both at Sharq al-Awsat and the National, we're looking towards that international audience that goes beyond boundaries. And I think that's a reflection of who I am. I don't see myself as belonging to only one city or one country, even though different countries or cities have impacted who I am. I see myself much more as global. And of course, there are people like the former Prime Minister of the UK that said, if you see yourself as a citizen of the world, you are actually a citizen of nowhere, or you don't belong anywhere. I don't believe in that. I think we can belong in different places at different times. And that multitude of identities is great because language and interests and trying to explain them. Our tagline for the National is the Middle East Explained. And it's not just explaining the developments of the Middle East, it's actually global developments, how they're seen through the prism of the Middle East. So the US-China competition is interesting to us in a different way than it is for a journalist that's writing for a purely American audience or for a purely Chinese audience. For us and our interests and what it means for our region, it's different. So those are the similarities, but they're also different. And I think the Arabic language, in some ways, we used to get away with a headline that's just 2 words, and that would tell you a lot. That is much more difficult to do in English. We could be quite direct and concise in Arabic more than you can do with English without being tabloid. We're not going to go down the tabloid route. Sharq al-Awsat was also very kind of, the broadsheet traditional tradition. So language plays a huge difference in the framing of certain stories and headlines and so forth. It is quite different in that sense. And I would say just finally, in terms of language, it was also interesting always to get the journalists who are, regardless of which country they're from, but who spoke both languages, but which one they'd be more comfortable with, or even if they didn't speak the same languages, had worked in both parts of the world and therefore were part of that mix. And it's a very interesting cohort of journalists who are connected both to the Middle East and the West. And I think I really see that here at the National, more than I did in the Sharq al-Awsat, where I had certain colleagues who were from the region and lived just very much isolated in a bubble, because at home they'd speak Arabic only, and they would work in the Sharq al-Awsat, and they almost didn't connect with the outer British world, where we don't have as much of that here. I think people really do connect locally, but also have that eye on what's happening in their home country or other countries.
It's very interesting. I love your comment about headlines. And it's true, Arabic is much more efficient. You don't always have to have all these articles and all these verbs, and I can totally see the benefit. How do you measure the success of a particular issue? This is a question from the field here. While a standard metric would be page views and impressions, do you have a more holistic view of how do you assess yourself and how you're doing?
There are so many metrics on how we're doing. So we don't do it per issue, so to speak. We do, we see in, the past 24 hours, how have we done? So part of it is page views, users, engagement, impressions on social media, how much we've been shared, our influence, who's sharing our content. So it might be somebody who only has 3,000 followers on Twitter, but they're all influential, and they're the sort of place we want to be. We want to appeal to decision makers, to a certain grouping of people who, if they're influenced by the National, will have consequences, so to speak, and we're able to enlighten them on certain things. We also want the mass appeal. If we have a video that has over 1 million views, that's seen as success because people are actually watching it. And how we measure views or listens on podcasts, it's not just a 3-second thing. It has to be a minimum of 20 seconds or a minute of listening to actually be registered with us as listenership. So part of it is those metrics, and that's really great in terms of what digital journalism has given us. And we have also analytics of how we're doing today compared to this time last week. And if we see we're doing well, what were the stories that did well? But so those metrics help us. But then there's others like exclusivity. How many exclusives did we get in a month? How many exclusive interviews did we get? What news did we break? I believe that part of our role is to make news, not just follow, be reactive, but be proactive. That's an important one. But a real measure of success is if we can actually affect change. And there have been stories where either somebody's needed some help in something, or we've been able to connect a researcher with somebody, or connect a small SME where somebody wants to invest in that, a small enterprise. Those are the moments when we're like, yes, that's real success. And they do happen, and they have an amazing consequence for us. So that's a real measure of success. And another measure of success and is when some of our colleagues leave and get hired to go to other places and they're successful. They're still part of the national cohort. And that's something that predates me. I think the national has been able to give amazing training to journalists that are doing great things in different parts of the world. And that's also part of our success, our team.
These are all beautiful measures of success, and definitely more holistic, as the questioner asked. I love what you said about people being hired away to other great things and so forth. That's something you have to learn in the course of a career, don't you? I remember the first time losing some great faculty member at the Institute of Fine Arts, but a person became a dean at Yale, and the president of NYU told me, Mariette, what part of success do you not understand? You should be happy that he's gone to do that, So that's a maturity that you gain over time, that someone leaving an organization is all right, as long as they go to do something that's meaningful and productive for them and redounds to the glory of your own institution. So I think that's an excellent lesson that you've
yeah, I think it's also how honest they are. I've had colleagues that come and say, look, we're really sorry that we're only going to be able to do the 4 weeks notice that that is in our contract. We'd love to give you more time, but we've gone a position here, and I'm like, best of luck. I don't mind that. But unfortunately you do have instances where people are not honest. And I think the way you leave an organization is so important. It reflects on you, it reflects on the organization you've been in. And I think we have to help people be successful, but you also have to be honest. And the biggest disappointment really was there were a couple of people who were dishonest about where they were going. And that hurts, because there's that element of trust that is broken. So I think that's also something to keep in mind.
Never burn any bridges when you're leaving or coming. It's a really important lesson. Thank you. You talked about influence and definitely seeing results, and influence can happen on micro scales and on macro scales. And of course, you in your beautiful career have also worked in policy as a fellow at Yale, as a young global leader with the World Economic Forum. You've had real influence. How do you think journalism can influence policy? What are the limits? What are the positive possibilities?
I think that is a really difficult answer to give, because it depends, right? So sometimes you can have a particular story that can impact policy directly. And either because something's been uncovered, or because you've been able to gather evidence that others haven't been able to, or it could be that you raise awareness about something and you can actually advocate for something. But journalists also have to be careful, because I think there is a type of journalism increasingly, especially with social media's influence, where people feel their number one role is just to advocate. It's this advocacy journalism that can almost lead you to miss important news elements. And so it's a fine balance, I think, by trying to influence policy. For me, when I went to Yale and then when I went to ISE, I wanted to step away and to actually understand how policy makers think and work. Part of it was because, for many reasons, but part of it was once I was interviewing an American diplomat who was in charge of the Syria file, and I was really pushing him on Syria. And he said, can we pause the interview? And I said, yeah, sure. He goes, what would you do? And I went quiet and I said, I'm sorry. He goes, what would you do? It was intractable elements of the Syria issue. And I don't want to go into too much detail because it was off the record. So I want to respect that for him. But he threw me when he said, what would you do? Because I'm like, well, it's not my problem. I'm here to ask the questions. And then I realized, okay, this is actually difficult stuff. This is not all of it. Again, talking about intentions and so forth. Sometimes people get into a problem, they're trying to solve it and they can't. And I wanted to step away and think, yeah, how do you solve these problems? And to get an understanding of it. And so I think with policy, journalists can affect policy through advocacy, through raising the bar on certain issues, uncovering certain issues. But also quite often, if we can help a particular person or situation that's quite limited, and then hope that there's a ripple effect, that can sometimes be as consequential as forcing a legislative change, which it takes a lot of effort, and it depends on the framing of the particular country that you're working on, and if it works that way and so forth. So again, this is not a very clear-cut answer, and I apologize because I think there are so many variables. But for us, what I hope we do at the Nationals, we try to help people in certain ways that we can raise attention about them or cast a light on them, give them a spotlight, and hopefully that will lead to change.
That is helpful. And I think there's maybe another set of terms in journalism or practices that can help elucidate this further that may be interesting for those of our students who are interested in pursuing this kind of career. Historically, papers, certainly since the 19th century, have valued a distinction between the editorial page, an op-ed, and news. But for all the reasons you've sort of talked about already, things slip in and papers have identities, of course, strongly in the West, certainly. How do you think about that at the National? What goes into the editorial and op-ed page? Where does the paper really have to draw the line and say this is news? How do you think about that distinction?
You know, I think it's really important to encourage journalists to write about things that they know well in. So we have certain news reporters where they've covered something, they've told the story as they saw it, but then they want to reflect. And we give them that possibility to do that in the opinion section, but to say, this is now your opinion. So you're not doing it as a news journalist, give us your opinion on it. I think with straightforward news and just telling the story, an opinion, you can see the distinction. The problem is when it becomes analysis versus opinion. Analysis is very different from opinion. Analysis is when I'm going to take as many sides of the story as I can and actually analyze what's happening. That's different from an opinion where you've already written the headline in your head and you already know what you want to say and you're looking for elements to put together to make that argument. That's opinion that too often in too many outlets gets sold as analysis. And that's different. So I think that in straightforward news writing, most outlets are quite good. This is the news element, but the editorializing comes in with the sort of language you want to use. So I'll give an example, the issue of ISIS. We always call them ISIS. There are many outlets that stick to calling it the Islamic State. And you know, they would say, well, it's our style. BBC, New York Times insist on calling it Islamic State. And so, but the problem is when you call it the Islamic State, that's what these people want to be known as. So you're giving them a credibility that you are, you know, bequeathing on them. You have a responsibility. And that's an editorial decision. And that is part of opinion. When we decide to say, no, call them ISIS, that is our taking a position. We've taken a position, but we're clear about it. So I think in terms of linguistic things like that, most serious outlets will have a conversation about it, come to a stylistic point and stick with it. And in opinion, you have to also show that actually, even though we're going to be right about ISIS and somebody might want to call them Islamic State, we say, no, we're still using ISIS. So you have to stick to your style. You have to have that framework and keep it. But as for our journalists, it's our job as the senior editors to say when you've put in too much opinion here. And you know, for me, that was a real challenge because I've been writing about Iraq from the day I became a journalist, and it's very personal, and I really do have an opinion. And so for me, you know, I remember when I first started, I'd literally write the piece, and this was another mentor that worked with me at Hayat told me, I'd write the piece, leave it, and come back to it half an hour later and read it. And I would literally be able to tick off, okay, these words are really emotive, take out some of the emotive language from news, but put that emotive language if I want to write an opinion piece. So I think it's also coaching and training from senior editors to help journalists through that.
What a wonderful piece of advice. This is in every walk of life, just taking a half hour of a breather and coming back to something you've produced or think you're going to say is actually a good, very good moderating and modulating influence. Very good idea. Several of our students and people tuning in here are very interested in what kind of skill sets they should, or attributes they should foster, self-develop, that would be most needed in journalism over the next 5 years, say. If they're trying to enter the job market now, what would you be looking for and your deputy editors be looking to hire?
So I would say there are 5 key skills. So the first is curiosity. If you want to get into journalism, you have to be curious. If you don't have that curiosity, there's no point. You will find this job really difficult because you'll have to come up with interesting storylines every day. There has to be enterprise journalism. And at the heart of it is curiosity. So 1 is be curious. 2 is general knowledge. I think we are suffering from a belief that you can get knowledge by Googling things, by looking them up. It's all out there. Why should I learn? Why should I read books? Why should I read the classics? It's all out there. There's knowledge that you get, and there is general knowledge that you have to have, that you can have that sense of, that doesn't sound quite right. That doesn't quite mesh up. And that comes from general knowledge. And general knowledge is from things like reading history books to keeping the habit of reading a newspaper every day. And it can be a digital edition, it can be an e-paper, it can be the national, anything else. But having that where the editors are actually choosing what you read rather than just reading what you're interested in, and therefore maybe missing things that would add to your general knowledge. So develop your general knowledge and have specific outlets that you go to and you read. The third in terms of skills is great communication skills. So be it writing skills, be it speaking skills, train yourself as to how you speak, how short you keep your sentences, feeling confident enough to speak to camera if you need to, and so forth. So communication skills, really important. Even if you're not going to be the one that's communicating or speaking, if you're a producer, if you're an editor behind the scenes, you have to be able to communicate with your team, but also with the guests that you might want to book if you're working in television, or the editor that's fact checking, etc. So communication skills really important. The fourth I'd say is today in our world, it is really important what your personal brand looks like. And so that is everything from what's your Twitter handle showing, who are you following? You know, this is part of your public persona, your Instagram, you know, your Facebook, whatever it is, whatever social media you use. There are some journalists who say, I refuse to do social media. It's like, you can't, like it or hate it. It's part of our extended world of the media now. And so you have to have some sort of persona, and how you build that persona tells people a lot about you, what your interests are, how serious you are about a certain topic, etc. So I think about that wider persona. And then the very last one, and this is to show, you know, it's important for us to be generalists, but you also have to have an expertise, a certain speciality, something that you really know it, and that you will stand apart. So, you know, nobody may pay attention to vaccines, and suddenly you're the only journalist that's dedicated all your time to vaccines, and you're the hottest ticket in the world because the time has come for you. So have your generalist knowledge. You have to slip into different things, especially if you're just getting into journalism. You know, you're not going to be doing the stories of your dreams from day one. That's normal. My first week of working at Hayat, I was told to paint the office of the printers because they wanted to get rid of me and they tried to scare me. And I did it. And then I was given all these silly, tedious tasks, and I did them just to show that I could. But my expertise was actually knowing Iraq really, really well. And certain things came up where they needed me. They needed, you know, I had very difficult few years when I first started in journalism. And I proved my worth by knowing something about something nobody else did. And so find that slice that you're going to be an expert on. And you may not use it for 5-10 years, but the time will come when you do. So know what you want to be an expert in.
Wonderful advice. Here's a question that I often get. So I'm going to first ask you the question the way it's put to me, and then because I think there's a connection between our contexts. So we're an American university, fully integrated into NYU, but also very much grounded here, and we're our own thing in and for the world. That beautiful campus behind me. And so very critical to having a credible academic institution is the freedom of academic inquiry and what we want to teach on our campus and so forth. And that really works here. At the same time, we're also grounded here. We don't just stay on our campus, we go out into the world of Abu Dhabi, the UAE, the region. And, you know, we're not in New York, just as NYU Shanghai is not in New York or in Abu Dhabi. And so you have to also be mindful of the society you operate in. And we have learned to square those circles very well, but I think so by talking about responsibility in this way. Several of our questioners here are asking about how is it different to operate an English newspaper here from, say, others that you're very familiar with, of course, from your career, and particularly, you know, how you handle perhaps topics that in the society would not be normally openly discussed. That's, of course, an issue that comes up for us sometimes when people move off of the campus. How would you answer that basket of questions?
It's a very valid question, and it's one that that often comes up. And to be frank with you, anyone who comes to work at the National, I raise it with them if they don't raise it with me. I think it's really important that we're aware of exactly the context that you put in. And I would say the following. The first is, I think, again, because we're very transparent and we're honest and we say you're coming from a place that is headquartered in Abu Dhabi, that sees the world in a different way, that sees challenges that are different here for us than they would be for somebody that's based in Greenland, for example. So I think that's one. Two is to understand, as you said, the society. I think we're based in a place that is really incredibly progressive. And this is a country that is not only ambitious, but wants to see the future and wants to leap into it while having a very firm grounding in its present and its past. And so to understand that and what the expectations are of the media. I think different societies have different expectations of what the media's role is, the university's role, and others. So our most immediate, let's say, circle, or our most immediate community expects from us to raise awareness, to cover events as they happen, does not perhaps expect of us to raise uncomfortable societal issues. And yet we may still want to. And so how do we do it? We do it with respect. We do it with understanding what are the laws here. I think especially for publishers, there are very clear laws, and those are things that we take into account. But there's also that idea of how can I come at this particular topic in a way that actually moves the subject forward rather than just wanting to provoke or to antagonize just to make a point. And I think actually we've been able to do quite a lot of that, and to work within a framework or a thinking, an approach that is, I want to write about this because it is in the public good. And I want to do this because I think this is how it would actually either benefit society or benefit the person I'm interviewing or so forth. But it is a conversation. It's engaging with those entities that might be affected. And some are great and accept, and some are not. And some may actually, very, very small minority, make it difficult for us. And then that's when you have to use some of your political capital, and all of us in all our work. And this is, and genuinely so, every single senior editor knows that when they work in a particular either society or work for a particular publisher, they'll have certain things they can't approach and you're asking in different places. In other places, commercial interests really come in very, very directly. There are certain topics, and there are many examples, be it in the UK or the US, where people have had to resign because they've written about something that actually harms a major advertiser or contributor. There are some, for example, when Bloomberg was running for the possibility of candidacy for the American elections, the Bloomberg editorial board stopped writing editorials because they were scared any editorial they write reflects on that. So these things come in different ways. They manifest themselves in different ways. I think we're very aware of them here because they get talked about a lot. And it's true. And I tell people, keep that at the back of your mind, not at the front of your mind. It's definitely there. But it's there for every single responsible news outlet. And some are very openly, right-wing or left-wing or have this political agenda. For us, it's more that we see ourselves as part of the makeup of Abu Dhabi, and we see and the wider UAE, and we really see our role as trying to let people know more about the UAE, about the region. And so we want to open doors rather than necessarily cause sparks to fly or otherwise. Our journalism is much more serious, but also much more targeted at understanding rather than trying to be sensationalist.
You've made a really important point about the lean of advertising and advertisers and following that money, as you talked about earlier, about doing your research and seeing where the interests lie in a story. The same goes for papers, and that may look different in different parts of the world, but some form of it operates everywhere. That's very, very interesting for us to think about, that contextualization, while also standing one's ground, which also sometimes is an important thing to do, as you've said. We're almost at the end of time. You've been incredibly generous with your time. Couple of questions that people are really curious about. So people want to know, making a decision as to what goes on the front page. What do you factor in? Is it about what stories people want to read or what stories people should be reading? This relates to what we've been talking about.
I think it's what people should read? What is the most important story? And the most important story doesn't necessarily have to be just what's the biggest story, because usually the biggest story is your top story on the front page. But what's an important story? You know, if women are suddenly, you know, you have to have one female representative on boards of listed companies in the UAE. For some, that's a technicality. For me, that's a huge advancement for women in the workplace. So that takes a place on the front page. So I think it's what stories we think people should read, and these are the most important stories of the day. But it's subjective, and you know, we usually have a meeting, which is actually at 6:30, with the senior editors, and say these are the stories we have, and we come together. And usually it's consensual, but at the end of the day, I have to make the decision. And so we come together. My colleagues say we think this, and we usually agree, because usually it's quite evident whether the top stories, or if it's an exclusive that we've brought, like an exclusive interview, so forth, we'll want to champion that so people see what original material we've brought in.
Yes, at some point, someone needs to make the decision, but it sounds like you have a culture of interaction and the frameworks, again, guardrails sort of around that. Here is an opportunity to tell everyone where to go look for how to read Mina at her very best, as you always are. Mina, could you please name the best or a few articles you have ever written? And how was it to write them? You must have some favorites.
Oh my God. So many. I don't know where to begin that I'm really proud of. I wrote last August, I wrote an opinion piece about what happened in August 1990, which was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. But the political decision my father did. My father was the first Iraqi diplomat to defect from Saddam Hussein's regime after the invasion of Kuwait, and our lives changed forever. And I had never written about it. I had never actually spoken about it publicly. You know, my friends knew and so forth. And I mentioned it to my colleagues once, and they said, "Oh, August is coming up. We have to do the anniversary stuff, whatever." And I don't know how I mentioned the impact it had on our family. And so my colleagues were like, "You have to write this. You have to write this." And I did it. And I was really, I feel like it's my parents' story rather than mine. I was 10, my sister was 12. It's really my parents' story. And so I actually asked my parents, and I said, "Listen, I'm going to write this. I'm going to say the decision you made," and so forth. And I said, "Yes." And I could not believe the reaction I had. People were really kind. There were people that I hadn't spoken to in about 10 years who wrote and said, "I never knew that about you. We never knew this happened." So that was really nice, and it was really personal, which I rarely, actually write a personal side. So that was nice to write, and it was kind of something that I think I've always wanted to write, and I got out of the way. But another article that I wrote for Shepolosov actually was. I interviewed 3 daughters of a woman who was killed in An-Nusur Square, that infamous killing by basically mercenaries in Iraq. And I got to interview the 3 daughters of a woman who her husband had died from a heart attack, and she worked basically as a taxi driver and was caught up in this to provide for her daughters. And they trusted me with their story, and I went to Jordan and I spent a lot of time with them before they told me the story. And I was really touched because after I was able to write their story, they had issues with their residency at the time with Jordan and everything, and it got sorted out. And actually, there was a lot of people getting in touch with me saying, "How can we help them? How can we help them?" And I was able to connect them. And so that was kind of nice, because that was one of those times where you write something and then you could actually pass it on. But I've been really lucky. I've been able to do interesting interviews and speak. I interviewed Prince Saud al-Faisal, who was Saudi Arabia's foreign minister for about 4 decades and rarely get interviews. And that was something I was really proud of doing, and he was great to speak to. But yeah, I've done lots of different stories that I'm quite proud of. It's hard. I haven't really got a list in my head, but I think that piece that I wrote last August was one of my favorites.
We will return to it because it's a remarkable story and it's a remarkable account that you wrote. Mina, thank you so much. I'm very proud that we haven't talked about COVID-19 at all. And so I'm just going to ask you for a final word. What would you say to our students and soon-to-be graduates of NYU Abu Dhabi about the prospects that you see ahead for this country entering the post-COVID world? Are we close?
I don't know what the post-COVID world is going to look like. But I think, one, we've been really lucky here. The fact that we are able to get vaccinated, get tested easily, and get that comfort by getting tested and knowing that we can, kind of live a life that is beginning to be more engaged with others because of all these privileges. Genuinely, it's kind of remarkable because there are very few places in the world that you can actually feel that way. But I think what that will look like eventually is yet to be seen. It depends on so much on medicine, on science advancements, and so forth. But what is clear is that the UAE is genuinely a global center, and the fact that people still come and visit here, and you still get to have amazing exhibitions being put on in different parts. We've just had Art Dubai and others, but they've thought of things, everything from being tested, social distancing, things like that. So we're lucky to be part of that experimentation that the whole world is going through. And this is a country that in some ways, in terms of size being manageable, but also great ambition and is innovative and agile, you can all be part of that. And I think, the graduates of NYUAD are going to be at the forefront of that, of coming up with ideas and seeing what that post-COVID world looks like. But also, that incredible importance of interaction and human connection that we're seeing is possible. A place like NYUAD that brings people from all over the world and is that microcosm, that's what we're going to need. The world can't disconnect. We've seen how difficult it is for people not to be able to travel, to meet in person, and so forth. So I think the skills you've picked up there and also the representation of that global world that you all bring will be crucial for us emerging from COVID-19.
Mina Al-Oraibi, thank you so much for the incredible work you do leading the National and for sharing so generously of your thought and time with us. It's incredibly encouraging to all. And we can't wait to see you with us on campus before long.
Inshallah. Thank you so much for hosting me. This was great fun. I appreciate it.
Okay. Bye, everyone. See you soon.
Bye-bye.